Well, good evening and welcome to Midweek Bible Study. We continue our walk this week through the book of Isaiah. This week we're going to actually touch on Isaiah 13. I hope this finds you well, and I hope that you'll consider joining us in person as we're able to walk through this together. It gives an opportunity for us to be able to communicate about it. But that invitation is there for you. We'd love to have you. Want to get started this evening, and before we do, though, we've seen a lot of problems in the beginning of Isaiah, and it's problems that are generated towards the Hebrew people, and we know that in this first part of the book, we see the problem that the Israelites gathered up the Assyrians and wanted their help against enemies that were coming from the north and other places. And so the Israelites, or at least the people in Judah, decided to reach out, or the king of Judah decided to reach out and ask for help from the Assyrians. Well, that was a no-no. And so we got to see some of the prophecy and everything related to what was going to happen to the kingdom of Assyria for doing what they were doing. But it would also have an effect on the Babylonian people, because the Babylonians were part of the problem as well. And they would actually be the ultimate ones that would take the Israelites into captivity. But nonetheless, we finally get to some prophecy about them as well. And so the Babylonians were seen as more powerful. They were a more powerful enemy. They would eventually carry the Israelites into captivity. And there's no disagreement really among the theologians for this chapter, or at least there's no main widespread disagreement about it. It doesn't mean there aren't disagreements. It just means there's no widespread ones. The biggest issue that they seem to be focused on is the word Massa. And it's translated in the New King James Version, which is the version that I'm using to teach out of here this evening. It's translated in it as the word burden. And it does mean burden in an ordinary sense. However, it tends to lend itself more toward prophecy. And the prophecy of what was to come for the Israelites would certainly be a burden on them. And the prophecy, I guess, against Babylon would be certainly a burden on them. But nonetheless, let's get started here this evening. And so the first verse, it says, "The burden against Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw." And the burden here would be against Babylon. The important thing here is that Isaiah was able to see what was coming. In all of his prophecy, he gets a vision of prophecies. He gets a vision of what's coming. It was something that he literally saw. Now, this is like every other one of his prophecies, but you just need to know that he saw it. The prophecy as well, I think there's something that we need to catch in this, is that it's a visual. It's not something that he's just thinking up. It's something that he gets a very vivid picture of. And so we get that. Going into verse 2, it says, "Lift up a banner on the high mountain, raise your voice to them, wave your hand that they may enter the gates of the nobles." And remember that this is a prophecy against the Babylonians. We have seen much prophecy against the Israelites as well as the Assyrians. But the banner is something that you need to pay attention to here, because it's typically something that's raised up high, and it organizes a group, for example, in military situations. It organizes them. We've seen banners used, for example, the rod raised with the serpent on it, which saved the Israelites when they focused on it from the vipers that were there. So lots of things are used as banner, but this would be raised on high, and it would get everybody's attention. It would be put up on a mountain that was laid bare. And why is that important? Well, it's because nothing else was in the way. There's no trees in the way. Everything is laid bare. The banner is up on high so that everybody can see it. And the banner is kind of interesting because it summons God's army together. It summons God's people back together to join this great battle to fight back against all of what has been going on. And the summons is made in three ways. One, by a signal or ensign lifted up on the hill, and you can see that with the banner. The second one is by a loud call or a shout. And then the third one is by waving or beckoning with the hand. And you need to understand that all of this God is directing, and it's pointing back to Him, but all these things are taking place to give a picture of what's coming, and also to give confirmation of what's coming and why. The mentions of nobles in here means that it would reach all the way to the top of the nation of Babylon. It didn't matter how high you were in the government or whatever, you literally would be affected by this. So it literally goes all the way to the bone, if you will. Verse 3 says, I have commanded my sanctified ones. I have also called my mighty ones for my anger, those who rejoice in my exaltation. Now, God would lay down His own orders here for those whom He calls as His instruments. The I in this is emphatic. It means it's coming from the Lord. I have called. It's not Isaiah calling. It's Isaiah's vision that he's seeing, but God's allowing him to see what God is doing. It's an insight, if you will, but God would literally charge people to serve for Him and fight for Him. But it shows the emphatic part of the word I, or the focus on God there, just really focuses everything back on God, and that it comes through His power, His strength, and it's all for His glory. In verse 4, it says, the noise of the multitude in the mountains, like that of many people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts musters the army for battle. Now, the Babylonians were taken out by the Persians in 539 BC. Now, they were known as mountain people, and that's where you get reference to here. And it's an indication, one, of their geography, but it's also an indication of their habits and their abilities that they had from living in the mountains. I mean, for example, if you were a nation of the mountains, you could fight in the mountains much better than you could anywhere else. And people that tried to take you out of your habitation would have a hard time conquering you because of your skill and your knowledge of working in the mountains. An illustration to it in more modern day, or I guess even days past, but more modern than this, would be like the Revolutionary War. And if you remember the movie The Patriot, which had Mel Gibson in it, and they were part of the militia, but they were part of the militia in the mountains. And as the English army was attacking, they were able to utilize their skills in the woods to be able to fight in a different way than the English were prepared to fight. And therefore, it gave them an advantage. And you kind of have to look at it that way. The mention of it, too, could have pointed also to what is the nation of Media, which is also known as Old Persia. And the text indicates that there would be many people and not necessarily one nation. So this could point to multiple nations, both Persia and Media. And so you get that picture as well from the text. Verse 5, it says, they came from a far country, from the end of heaven, the Lord and His weapons of indignation to destroy the whole land. And both Media and Persia, though, would have been countries that are far away from Israel. They would not have been close by. And it says to the end of the heavens. Note that in older days, there were many that thought that the world had an end to it, if you will. And so when you reach the ends of the earth, in other words, where the sky meets the ground, that's pretty much where it ends. And so when they would have come from afar, they would have come from the end of heaven, if you will. In verse 6, it says, wail, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will be limp. Every man's heart will melt, and they will be afraid. Pangs and sorrows will take hold of them. They will be in pain as a woman in childbirth. They will be amazed as one another. Their faces will be like flames. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. Now, these verses point to the day of the Lord, and this is where all of the wrong, if you will, is made right. There would be great tribulation, and it would lead to utter desolation for those being punished. One thing in here as well, especially with verse 10 and its use of constellations, they point directly to Orions. Now, Kessel the Fool was the Hebrew name for the constellation of Orion. He was identified with Nimrod, who was involved in a folly that contended against God. The Babylonians were very well connected to constellations, and so when God did his destruction, he literally cut to the root of where the problem was. And you get sorcery and all kinds of other things that happen with the focus on constellations. And this would be directly at it. It talks about every man's heart will melt and they will be afraid. Pangs and sorrows will hold over them. There would be mass confusion. And don't get me wrong, this would be massively painful. When you cut to the root of the problem and you get to the source of it, you tend to hurt it much worse than just a loss in a battle, for example. And God tends to do that. He's very serious when it comes to punishment. He's very serious when he calls us to order as well. Verse 11 says, I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will halt the arrogance of the proud and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I will make a mortal more rare than fine gold, a man more than golden wedge of sapphire. Now the offenders to God would be absolutely devastated. This would include commodities. It would include everything that they hold most dear. Commodities such as gold would be done here. The reference to a golden wedge of sapphire, that seems to be, or at least what I could find, it seems to be a gold that is refined so well that it's more pure than anything else. And God's devastation would be for everything that they hold of value. And so if all of your value is gone, how do you rebuild? You don't. You'll see that here in just a minute. Verse 13 says, Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts and in the day of his fierce anger. It shall be as the hunted gazelle and as a sheep that no man takes up. Every man will turn to his own people, and everyone will flee to his own land. Anyone who is found will be thrust through, and everyone who is captured will fall by the sword. Their children also will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be plundered, and their wives ravished. Now, if you read this closely, you get the idea that there would be a mass confusion here. There would be an order to things, or where there is an order to things, it would be upended and destroyed in the day of the Lord. Now, why is that important? Well, it's much like in the Continental Army that I mentioned earlier. When they killed British soldiers, they killed the leaders of those soldiers. And when they killed the leaders, the armies disbanded because they had nobody to lead them. When the leader was gone, they were confused and ran. And in this case, you would see a nation that would have everything in order, and all of their things from king down would have order to it. But God's devastation that he puts on them because of what they've done would be so devastating that it would make everything confused and it would uproot everything. Those that survived would be taken captive and made slaves to captors in a foreign land. Everything would be taken and flipped and turned upside down. Verse 17 says, "Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, who will not regard silver, and as for gold, they will not delight in it." Now, the Medes were mentioned all the way back to Moses' time. They were not especially a warring nation, or even one that was mentioned as a powerful nation or a major nation. They were mentioned several times for different things, and even times where they had been partially captive, or part of their kingdom had been captive. But God would stir even them up to be a part of this devastation that was going to happen. However, they would, what they would do, it would humble this powerful nation. It would humble them. They're being taken over by an unpowerful nation, or one that's not of power. Verse 18 says, "Also their bows will dash the young men to pieces, and they will have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eye will not spare children." Now both the Medes and the Persians, they were skilled archers. Their shots would be devastating to their targets. But this devastation didn't hold any kind of empathy or anything toward any particular person. It was just going to take them out. So it's literally picking targets. And so everybody was fair game, I guess, if you will. In verse 19, it says, "In Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of Chaldeans' pride, will be as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited, nor will it be settled from generation to generation, nor will the Arabian pitch tents there, nor will the shepherds take their sheepfolds there, but wild beasts of the desert will lie there, and their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches will dwell there, and wild goats will caper there. The hyenas will howl in their citadels, and jackals in their pleasant palaces. Her time is near to come, and her days will not be prolonged." Now, the mention of Babylon, the kingdom or the glory of kingdoms, focuses on and consists of three things. First of all, it consists of her antiquity. Keep in mind that God, when he humbles, he humbles. So we have things that nations take pride in, and one of the things that Babylon took pride in is her antiquity and her history and all of that. The second thing would be in her origination of literature, architecture, and other arts, which all passed from her to Assyria and thence to other nations of Asia. So this was part that would be stripped away, taken, and distributed. So her wealth would be no longer to her, it would be to everybody else. And then in the third thing, in her magnificence and the magnificence of her kings, which provoked the admirations of the Assyrians herself. And so this would be taken and separated, and it would be no longer valuable to the Babylonians. Now all of the wealth and the splendor would be destroyed and stripped of its magnificence. There is a mention here too of Sodom and Gomorrah. You got to understand that the mention of Sodom and Gomorrah with anything is not a good thing. The prophetic notion of no inhabitants took a while, but it did happen. It actually took about 180 years. Excuse me. It's also seen as a place that's haunted by evil spirits, which the mention in verse 20 of no Arabian tents being pitched there, and it's because of the idea that it's a cursed place, and so that doesn't happen, and so nobody will inhabit that place again. So that prophecy is seen through and has proven to come. Now that was the end of chapter 13. I hope that you enjoyed that. I know it was relatively short, but it was 22 verses and not 6, which is what we had last week. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that you'll come and join us in person. Next week we'll study chapter 14. I pray God will bless you. I pray that you have a good rest of the week, and we'll talk to you soon.